Drill into some of the specifics now with CBS News contributor and award-winning historian, filmmaker, columnist and knight, Sir Niall Ferguson. Good morning and welcome. So as we've just heard, Israel is not a part of this agreement. There are questions as to how any nuclear component will be confirmed eventually. So what are your key questions as this framework is announced and as the U.S. and Iran both seem to tout different aspects of it?
Well, the devil will be in the detail, and so it's way too early to pass judgment since we haven't seen the detail. One important point, the most important in the short run, is will the Strait of Hormuz in effect be under Iranian control from now on? That would be a major setback from the point of view of regional stability. The Iranians are making the claim that that will be the case, whereas their Gulf neighbours very much wanted a return to the status quo ante bellum, the situation before the war. Then, of course, there's the question that your correspondent raised, what actually happens with the highly enriched uranium. Reports suggest that the Iranian government is making it less and less accessible than it was already made by the bombing that happened last year. And then, crucially, the third point is how quickly can the Iranians get their hands on the frozen assets and have sanctions relief? If that is going to happen relatively soon, then I think many people, including former President Obama, will say this is a much worse deal than the JCPOA that he negotiated. So it's going to, I think, be quite challenging for Vice President Vance and his colleagues to make the case in the coming days that they've come up with something better. The final thing I'd say is it's perhaps important not to just leap to judgment. We don't know where we'll be later this year, how resilient the Iranian regime will prove when peace comes. And I think there are some people, at least in the administration, hoping that by the end of the year, the situation will have changed domestically in Iran in ways that will look strategically much better for the United States.
And Sir Niall, timing is often everything. This announcement of a deal or a framework, whatever you want to call it, the memorandum of understanding, comes on the eve of the president leaving for the G7 summit. Do you think that timing was important, that he wanted to really get this done because of the G7?
I think the timing he was most interested in was the timing of his 80th birthday. President Trump has been noteworthy for worrying about the feelings of American allies at any point in his time as president. And indeed, one feature of this conflict was how very damaging it was, especially to transatlantic relations, which in some ways hit an all-time low at the beginning of the war, when there was great reluctance on the part of the Europeans and the UK to have any part in the US-Israeli attack on Iran. But everybody's breathing a sigh of relief in Europe and around the world that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be reopened, because the nightmare scenario was going to be that this dragged right through the summer. And if it had kept dragging on through the summer, then the economic consequences, especially in terms of higher inflation, but also real shortages in certain key commodity markets, would have been a major headache. Especially for the other members of the G7, with the possible exception of Canada, who are more exposed than the US to a big shock to the market for hydrocarbons.
And what do you think will come out of this summit? President Trump was so critical of European allies when it came to, in his view, them not helping open up the Strait of Hormuz. So what developments might come out of this get-together? It's being hosted by the French President, Emmanuel Macron.
Well, President Macron will be a little nervous. He always has a slightly fixed grimace, a kind of fake smile on his face when he meets with President Trump. His fear will be that President Trump will give vent to some of the feelings that he certainly has about the way the other European leaders, as well as his northern neighbour in Canada, responded. The Japanese, of course, will be represented too. They have their own set of worries that relate to Taiwan. I imagine there'll be a kind of painful politeness maintained, simply because by getting this memorandum of understanding done, the president avoids being under the kind of pressure he would have been under if the war had just been raging on. That's not to rule out a resumption of conflict. You rightly have emphasized in your coverage that there isn't really any kind of a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. The situation in Lebanon remains extremely fraught. And President Trump has had to lean very, very hard indeed on Prime Minister Netanyahu to make sure that Israel didn't trip up his negotiations with Iran. But I think on the whole, this G7 is going to go much more smoothly as a result of the news that broke yesterday.
Likely with painful politeness.
Yeah.
Thank you. I like that you put it that way. Sir Niall Ferguson, we appreciate you so much.
My pleasure.